quite close to my heart. It's garnered a lot of attention in the last couple years, and I think rightly so. So I'm excited to spend our morning together today talking about this with you guys. Okay, so before we begin, let's just take a mindful moment. I know that's a very popular term these days, but what I'd love for us to do is just to take a deep breath together as a group. Just to recognize where we're at, maybe where we are physically, emotionally. There can be a lot of multitasking when we're on our computers, if we're at home, a lot of distractions. So I just invite you to slow down for the next 2-ish hours and be present with us today. Okay, so here's our agenda for our time together today. So the font is purposeful. As you can see, it increases in size and it'll increase in the time you spend on these topics. So I want to spend the majority of our time talking about organizational strategies to address staff well-being or secondary traumatic stress, which is purposeful. So we're going to start by doing a bit of a review around indirect trauma, secondary trauma. I think it's important to do some level setting as a group and ensure that when we're talking about secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, we're talking about the same thing. And I also believe it's important for helping professionals to have a space to recognize that this work has an impact on us and that you're not alone with that. We'll then move to talking about individual strategies to address secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. You yourselves are a component of making sure that you take care of yourself and your emotional needs in the way that you can and address things that are triggering for you based on your history. And we each have a responsibility to address this. So we're going to talk and spend some time talking about self-care strategies we can use to kind of build up our toolbox. But I also believe that our organizations have a responsibility as well. And that up till recently, even though we initially began to realize that there's a price to pay to doing this work, the pushback has really been, okay, then staff need to take care of themselves, right? Let's just bathe in self-care. And the idea that it's solely the responsibility of the staff to deal with what we know now is the emotional pull of the work. But I think that's only half the game. So we'll spend a lot of our time talking about those organizational strategies today. I will say that my presentation style is quite casual. I'm eyeing the chat box. I definitely urge you guys to ask questions, raise your hand. In a little, I'll ask to hear your voices. So please feel free to engage throughout the presentation. Okay, so when you guys registered to participate, you were asked this question: how well does your organization currently address compassion fatigue and secondary trauma? And I just wanted to note that it's kind of all over the place here, right? So I'm glad we're talking about this topic today. It might be hard to see on the screen, but about 30% of you said extremely to very well, which is exciting. About 50% said moderately, and about 20% said slightly or not at all. So again, I'll be asking some reflective questions of you guys today about either the skills we're going over or how something would work in your organization or what do you do in your organization. So especially that 30% of extremely to very well or moderately, I'd love to hear from you guys as well, and we can all learn from each other. Okay, so let's dive into doing a bit of a review around indirect trauma. So in our professions, and I know there are varied professions on this webinar, we might be directly exposed to trauma in the homes we visit or the neighborhoods we go into. However, the more common way that we're going to be impacted by the work that we do is indirectly. And so what I mean by that is hearing kiddos' stories of the difficult or scary things they've gone through, reading narratives or reports from children and families being harmed or mistreated, right? It's that day in, day out closeness to trauma. And this can really impact everyone in the organization. And I really want to start out with that because I think there's this thought sometimes that I hear that, okay, let's get support to our frontline workers or clinicians or folks that are just directly working with kids and families. But what we know is that secondary trauma or indirect trauma can impact the whole organization, right? It can sometimes feel isolating for leaders or managers or supervisors who are exposed to the reality of child trauma regularly, yet they may not have the supports that maybe frontline workers have. So when we're thinking about this topic and we're talking about secondary trauma and indirect trauma, we want to be thinking about the whole organization. Okay, so there's a lot of different terms out there. I've already used several, and it might get confusing. So I just wanted to help differentiate between the types of stress that we're talking about and the stress that can occur in our workplaces. So I've kind of broken them up into these two buckets. We've got the organizational and the interpersonal. So organizational stress is what we think of as burnout, which might be a term that sounds familiar to you all. And we can think of that kind of stress as the workplace stress. So the commute to work, the paperwork that's piling up on your desk, the time crunches, the meeting, back-to-back meetings, maybe salary, maybe the workplace culture, right? All that stress that comes from being in an organization. And that's not necessarily unique to child trauma in our field. That's with all organizations. And then we've got interpersonal stress, which is the emotional impact of working with children and families exposed to trauma, which is really where we'll center on today in our time together. So we're talking about interpersonal stress. We're talking about compassion fatigue. And I really think of that as like an umbrella term. It's the broad impact that we have of working in and around trauma. So the cognitive impact, physical impact, the emotional impact, that feeling exhausted from the work even after we've come back from vacation. It's dreading seeing certain clients or avoiding certain types of work. It's that heightened anxiety that you might feel, that extra irritability, right? And that's the impact of working in this field. And then we can think about secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. That's often how they're used in the literature. But we think about compassion fatigue can kind of turn into secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, which we think about as maybe a bit more severe. It resembles more closely post-traumatic stress disorder. So really that avoidance, hypervigilance, cognitive distortions, those kinds of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So I've separated these out into these two different types of stress, but I do want to stress that they are interrelated. We can imagine that if we're in an organization where we're feeling that we have a lot of burnout, we're really just kind of worn down by those organizational workplace stressors, we're more vulnerable then to that secondary trauma, that vicarious trauma. So while they're kind of distinct, they're also interrelated. And we talk about them differently because the intervention or what we do to address those types of stress are going to be different, right? Okay, so I wanted to share this slide because I really love it. It's adapted from Trauma Informed Oregon, which is a great resource. I've added the website there if you'd like to check them out. But I like this slide because it really highlights the impact of trauma on the workforce and how widespread this is. And I really think we've come to a point as a field that this is no longer something we can ignore. I think we've been talking about this for a while. We've definitely been talking amongst each other as professionals and colleagues, and we have the data as well. So when we think about social workers, we see here 65% in one study had at least one symptom of secondary traumatic stress. When we're looking at social workers again, in another study, 42% had experienced at least 4 or more ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And so what that tells us too is that not only are we working in this highly specialized field of child maltreatment, but the folks coming into this field, not all, but some, also have their own vulnerabilities that we have to take into account. We see in law enforcement, 37% of correctional officers experienced burnout. And in child welfare, we see that 50% had traumatic stress symptoms in the severe range. And this last statistic about turnover, we know affects not only child welfare, but a lot of the fields that deal with child trauma and child maltreatment. That turnover is unsustainably high, right? I know in California, some counties we see above 50%. Okay. So what I want you guys to do is just take a look at this list. These are just some ways that people can behave. I'd love for you guys to just take a minute, review this list here, think through it. We see avoidance, having preoccupation with stories, intrusive thoughts, or maybe nightmares, trouble sleeping, that heightened anxiety, maybe irrational fears, worried about things that you usually wouldn't be worried about, feeling isolated, having no one to talk to, maybe feeling trapped, depressed, having difficulty separating work from personal life. It all feels like one big blur. Maybe you're noticing some difficulty in your personal life, treating your loved ones a bit differently, maybe having less patience, or having that anger and irritability. So what I'd like us to do together, our first kind of poll that we'll do, it will be anonymous, so no one will know your answer, and it will just be a simple yes or no. But what I'd like you to think, I'm going to go back to that slide for a second so we can look at those items and think about, have I experienced at least 3 of those, let's say in the last 6 months? So I think Jess will go ahead and launch our poll. Thank you so much. Again, looking at these items here, have you experienced at least 3 of these in the past 6 months? And I recognize that this past 6 months are a unique 6 months, but nonetheless, you can go ahead and answer those. So just, I can't see the numbers coming in, so I will leave it to you to let us know. I think our target will probably be about 80% of you guys, hopefully, answering this. Again, it's anonymous, and then you can share that with me.
Looks like we are at 70% participation. So
that's quick, guys.
Yeah, we're almost there. Let's see. Well, it's quickly rising. We're at 75% participation, just a few more of you, and then we're going to share the results.
If your answers to the concert question is any indication of your engagement, I'm really excited. That was really fun to hear. And so I expect that same level of engagement as we talk about secondary trauma.
Okay, we got really close. 77 out of 101 of you answered, so I'm going to share those results, Melissa.
Thank you. Okay. 90%. 90%. It's pretty high, right? So I just like to hear from you guys when you hear that 90% of folks on this call, and I believe folks on this webinar are from different fields, different types of organizations as well, that 90% of you have experienced symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. What are just some thoughts that come to mind? Please feel free to add in the chat box. Surprised, not surprised, what you expected. So the word exhaustion, that sucks. Yeah, that's a really high percent. Sadly, not surprised. Yeah. So thanks, Heather. Maybe you expected about 75%. We have hard jobs. Not surprising, right? Okay. It's what I hear from my colleagues. It's what we're hearing from each other. Heather, I really appreciate your openness to share, currently avoiding a client, right? And doing this training instead. So thinking I'm new to this work, I'm not sure if I can do it. Wow, I really appreciate that, Linda. Right, and thinking about not only in the context of our work, but adding on the additional stress of what's happening in the world right now. Absolutely. So I really appreciate your engagement in this and your openness. Maria just mentioned that she's not alone, and that's one part that we do this activity. Yes, it's a really high number, and I want to let you know that I've done this activity now with a dozen or more organizations, and the number is always above 70%. And what those items were, there were symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, right? And so your response is very typical of the response that we typically hear. There's some folks that are surprised by that, right? But the majority is not surprised. And there's one sentiment that I often hear after that, which is, this is just the nature of the work. It's what happens. It's what happens when we do this kind of work, right? And there's something in that I would like to fundamentally change, which is almost a resignation that this is just part of the job. This is just what happens when you do this work. And I think at an organizational and individual level, we're buying into that a bit. But what we know is that it doesn't have to be this way. There is a difficulty and a strong emotions that come with this work that you know are just a part of our job. But do we have to get to a point where we're having symptoms of secondary traumatic stress? My hope is no, right? And my hope is that as we work through this presentation, we'll talk about some strategies to reduce that. But right now, I think the reality is true that this is really high, because this isn't, and that's no one's fault, right? We haven't been trained in our programs. We're not trained on this. We're not given the tools really to address this. One other thought I had as your answers were coming in is, that thought of I'm not alone, which I really appreciate, because this is not something that we often talk about in our organizations, right? And I think about the parallel to child trauma for a second, right? We think about, why don't kids report abuse? It's because there's that shame and worry about being blamed. And it can be a similar process for our own emotions and our own secondary trauma. Maybe we're worried to share our experiences because we worry that we'll be blamed for our emotions. And so we stay quiet or we don't talk about it, right? Because it's just not done or it's not normalized, right? And again, I just want to highlight that that's not anyone's fault. And this is why I'm advocating for our systems to be able to support us in the difficult roles that we do. Great. Okay. So now what we're going to do is shift a little to talking about what are some individual strategies to address compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. Again, I didn't spend too much time. I think it's pretty intuitive as you guys' answers are flowing in and the responses, that we understand that this work is challenging, that it impacts us, that, as Heather says, helpers feel deeply. And this is something that we need strategies to address. So you might have heard on my soapbox in the beginning, as I'm talking, I'm advocating for including organizations in this conversation. But of course, there is a need for us to take stock in our own well-being, which I personally think is also very cool. I think the fact that for me to be the best at my job and to last in my career, I need to work on being a well-balanced, wholehearted person. And I think that's a win-win situation. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about these individual strategies, things we can do, things that are in our control. And I've tried to narrow it down to those top strategies that I think can have a real impact. Okay, so I'm not going to teach these as skills. I'm pretty sure these are all things that we know, but we sometimes need a reminder to do. As you guys were saying in the chat, the work that we do, the environment that we're in right now, the time we're living in, it can be chaotic and crisis driven. And when we're in that space, it's really hard to remember or to feel like we have time for self-care. And so I hope this slide and these slides serve as kind of like a ding, like a gentle reminder to shift and place emphasis back on this part of our lives. So just some suggested self-care strategies. Self-regulation skills, right? So things like relaxation and really finding what works for you. It doesn't have to be yoga, it doesn't have to be meditation, but what are some things that help you bring those feelings down, whether it's standing outside and getting some sun or taking a walk, but really reflecting on what's going to help you bring your own emotions down. It could be positive self-talk. So we call that kind of our conscious narrative when we're driving to work that day. What are we saying to ourselves in our head? Oh my God, this is going to be such a hard day. It's going to be so difficult. I just really can't wait for it to be over. Or is there something else we might be able to say to ourselves that might help bring those emotions down rather than up, right? Singing in the car on the way to work, great. I love that example. Absolutely, dancing, getting time for that 5 minutes, right? And I love that you guys are already on top of this. And not surprisingly, because we talk about self-care often lately, right? And it doesn't have to be this long thing. It could be something like 5 minutes long. So things like positive coping strategies. And what I mean by that is expressing and sharing our feelings. So who are the safe and stable people in your life that you can talk to? When we think about the parallel here with child trauma too, we know that relational component, that relational support is such an important variable of resilience. And it's the same for us as adult humans as well. We need that connection. Great. Taking a walk, taking a break, those are some other positive coping strategies. Personal reflection. So I heard prayer, I heard taking 5 mindful minutes, right? Time to think, reflect, and just be. And that's easier said than done. It's very hard to quiet our minds. And again, this doesn't have to be a long thing, but just finding some time in your day, whether it's in your personal life at home and at work, to take that time and just reflect. How am I feeling? What's going on for me? Maybe labeling those feelings, right? Okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling avoidant. And then problem solving. So obviously, but what I want to say about this one is that it might not be the most useful when you're totally overwhelmed, right? When you're in that crisis mode. Self-regulation, personal reflection, taking that pause, taking that time is going to be the most helpful when we're highly dysregulated, right? And we tell our kiddos that too, right? We just want them to calm down first, and then we can start to share and talk. So it's the same thing with us as adults as well. What I want to highlight about this is that we need to carefully and honestly assess our own situations. Is there balance between the nurturing and the depleting activities in our life, right? Do we have access to regular exercise, non-work interests? Is there people we can talk to? Are we relying solely on alcohol, food, gambling, shopping to de-stress ourselves? I think our profession is highly specialized in what we do, and so I think our self-care should be highly specialized as well. So it's thinking about, what I hope from this is checking in on maybe what things have fallen off, what things we can bring back, and creating a toolkit with a bunch of these skills that might be right for you, because sometimes some are going to be right and sometimes others are going to be right. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this. I'm just going to highlight this. This is a great handout that you guys are going to get. It's from Tend Academy, from Francois Mathieu, and it's the top 12 self-care tips. So she's an expert in compassion fatigue and secondary trauma and self-care. She's narrowed it down to the 12 ones that she finds most helpful. Again, this is an individualized process, what's right for you, but you'll get this handout and be able to go through and just reiterate some of those individual strategies that we just kind of touched on. Okay. Another helpful tool that we can have in our own control is this app, which I find very cool and helpful. It's called the Provider Resilience app. You can easily download it on your phone. There's tools on here that are quick and easy exercises to do at your desk, those mindful and meditation practices. I'm not sure if they have funny, cute animal videos, but they might. They also have this measure on there, the professional quality of life measure, the ProQual, which is the most widely used and disseminated measure to assess our own compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, and burnout. So you can go on there and they give you a score that relates to others, whether you're in the low, moderate, high range. And I think that can be a helpful starting place to recognize where we're at and then realize, oh, okay, I might have to add in a little bit more of those coping skills or those problem-solving skills. Great. Okay. And the last resource, the last thing we'll talk about around our individual strategies to address staff well-being is this compassion fatigue workbook, which I'm really excited that CalTrin is going to give one away to you guys. I think at the end of the presentation, those folks will share a little bit about how that happens. See, it's real, we have it. It's a great workbook. It really goes into detail, again, about how do I assess my own warning signs that maybe I'm entering into kind of a danger zone of compassion fatigue or secondary trauma or burnout, and how do I create my own individualized toolbox of those self-care strategies. And this is also from the folks at the Tend Academy. Okay. So if you notice this slide, it's from the sanctuary model, but not surprisingly, like what we've been talking about, when we start to work with kids and families that are struggling with trauma, we as helping professionals can start to take on those characteristics. And this is what we call that parallel process, right? So we have clients who feel unsafe, hypervigilant, angry, irritated. We can start to take on those characteristics as well. But it doesn't just stop there. Our organizations can experience this parallel process as well. And that's where we're going to start shifting into talking about. Okay, so we've known this to be true for a little bit, right? That this work impacts us and it impacts our organizations. So why has it been this way for so long? I think part of it is this message that we have that if you're tough enough and you're cool enough and you're committed to your case enough, you'll just keep on keeping on. You'll just suck it up, right? And I think despite this push for self-care, I think this message might still exist within the nooks and crannies of our organizations and maybe even within ourselves. We know that this work impacts us, yet we sometimes wear it as a medal of honor. Like, I've heard it all, nothing affects me. But I really want to challenge that logic that this shouldn't be something that we take pride in, that I'm not impacted, I don't have emotions or feelings from this work, right? This can be a really dangerous message, especially if we think about new staff or interns, what that message sends to them. I'd like for us to look on the other side of our armor and begin to pause and say, wait a minute, I am impacted by this work, and what can I do about it? And so we're shifting our perspective and shifting our message, hopefully, that the new expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water and not get wet, right? We know we have these difficult feelings from the work. We know that at some point or at lots of points in our jobs, these difficult feelings will arise. Maybe we won't be able to let thoughts go. Maybe we'll be avoiding that client. Maybe we won't be able to sleep as well, right? And so I think the question becomes now, how can we prepare our staff and our workplaces for this? Unfortunately, it's not a pizza party. I wish that was the answer. I feel like it's been the strategy, but it's not the full picture here. Although I am in no way not recommending pizza parties for your organization. We just know that it's more than that, right? So I just wanted to share this cartoon because I love it. Okay. So now we're going to talk about what are those organizational strategies to address secondary traumatic stress. So there are lots that our organizations can do. What we're going to talk about today is just a couple pieces of that puzzle. There's many factors that have to come into play for an organization to be truly trauma informed and trauma responsive to clients and staff. But one of those pieces that I'm going to introduce is somewhat of a different way to do that check-in or supervision or support for staff. So that's what we're going to focus on. Okay. So in your chat box, when you hear the word reflect, what comes to mind? Just first stuff that comes to mind. Contemplate. Pause. Rethink, taking time to honestly consider, visualize, meditate, breathe, dig deep. You guys are already going beyond where I thought you would. Mirroring, absolutely evaluating, stopping. My lack of time each day to do so. That's why we're here, Jennifer. Yeah. Looking at myself, reframing, big sigh. Okay, absolutely. So these are the answers. So great job. So when we think about the word reflect, there's the two most common uses of that word. The first is to mirror back something, right? And I heard that in the chat box. That's what a mirror does, right? It reflects back something, it bounces back that image. And so reflecting, however, is about, giving that back, right? Mirroring, but it's also about looking internally, which you guys got as well, right? Looking within ourselves. And so when we're talking about a reflective practice, we want to make sure that we're looking at both ends. And so we're going to be talking about reflective practice and reflective supervision as one tool that organizations can use to address secondary trauma in the workplace. I'm going to use the term reflective practice and reflective supervision and go back and forth. Reflective practice is this broader concept, and reflective supervision is just using reflective practice within supervision. So we're going to use that as our example today, but I do want to highlight that the skills and what we'll go over today, we can use not just within supervision, we can use in all of our interactions with our colleagues and in our organizations. Okay. So reflective supervision or reflective practice is the mindful welcoming in of the feelings that staff have related to the work that they do. I want to highlight right off the bat very strongly, that reflective supervision is not therapy. It is not counseling. It's just not. It's not intended to be that way. And I think, I've done this work now with several organizations helping to implement reflective supervision within their organization. And this is the greatest fear of doing this, that I'm not a therapist or I'm not a counselor. And so this feels a little uncomfortable. And it will feel a little uncomfortable for some of you. For others, you might do this already and maybe just not have the language for it. But again, we'll talk more about this as we go, but it is different than therapy and counseling. When we talk about reflecting and welcoming in those feelings of the work from our staff, the focus is always going to be on, and how does that impact the job you do? And that's really where that differentiation happens. So we want to think about our role in our organizations. Are there ways in which we're encouraging the folks that we're working with, whether that's in traditional supervision, whether that's in a meeting or casual interaction with folks? Are we affording an opportunity for them to, first of all, to reflect internally on what's happening to them, and then try to put some words to that? And then do we provide ourselves an opportunity to listen, really listen to that, and check out we made sure, check out to make sure what we heard was correct. So this is kind of the first skill of reflective supervision. We call it reflective listening. It seems pretty simple, but it's the most challenging one, I would say, that we're going to talk about. So I just want to stop here for a second, engage the group. What comes to mind when you hear this, when you hear about reflective listening, reflective supervision? Again, some of you might do this, it might come really natural. Others might be like, I have never done that. I'm not sure I could do that. So just love to hear from you a little bit when we're talking about reflective listening, reflective supervision, what's coming up for you all. Yes, okay, maybe we're excited about this. So that's good. So pause and then move forward with solutions. So we're going to come back to that point over and over again when we're talking about this. That's a really good piece of this. Great. So some of us already, I feel, have a knowledge of what this is and are excited to maybe practice. Others, this might be brand new and excited to learn more. Wherever we're at, it's great. Okay. One thing I want to highlight is that, again, you might already be doing this, but when we're talking about reflective supervision as a skill, we're not talking about adding more to your plate. This isn't something separate that you're going to do in addition to your supervision or in place of your supervision. This is something that gets infused within just the way you communicate, right? And so we know that there's so much, and you guys are so busy, and there's so many things coming at us in our organization. There's tons of trainings. What I hope is that this is, by the end, that these are just skills that you try and infuse and that they don't take up more time. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for a second, and we're going to do something brave together. I know this is a really big group, but I really, really believe that the best way to learn about reflective supervision is to see it in action rather than just hear me talking about it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask for a volunteer. And if you are, I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but if you're willing to volunteer, you can just throw your name in the chat and I'll call on one that I see. So we're just going to have a brief conversation. It's 10 minutes, a brief conversation just to chat about your work and your role. The focus will really be on me as a supervisor. Nothing personal in nature. I won't ask any personal questions, completely just work focus, just a chat asking you about your job and your role. So if someone would be willing to volunteer, I would really love that. So great, we've got a volunteer, which makes me so happy. Rochelle, okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. We're gonna see how this works, guys. Okay, so nice to see your faces. So Rochelle, thank you so much. Oh, there you are, great, I can see you. Hi, Rochelle. Am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, Rochelle.
Rochelle, okay, wonderful. First of all, I just want to thank you so much. I'm going to talk to the rest of the group for a second, and then we'll come back and we'll have a conversation, okay? Okay, so I think your mics are all muted, but just a reminder to keep your mics muted during this part. Whatever's shared, I'm not sure if any of Rochelle's colleagues are on the call, but what we talk about here will just stay here, so it'll just be kind of confidential. And we're just going to ask, I'm just going to ask some questions about the work she does. I'm going to try to work hard to make sure that I don't cross any boundaries, that I won't ask any questions that would be kind of incorrect to ask in a professional setting. But sometimes when we ask about feelings, we stumble into these things that evoke a response from a person. So Rochelle, I'll give her full permission to just pass or move on if there's a question that she doesn't want to answer. Okay. So when we're done, me and Rochelle will process a bit what it was like to be part of this. And then I'm going to ask you guys for some of your observations. So what I'd like for you guys to do is not to focus on Rochelle, but to focus on me. And it's not really about her answers, but really about the questions that I'm asking. So what are you noticing about the questions? What would it feel like if your supervisor was asking you these questions? Would you ever ask these kinds of questions? So again, thinking about those kind of observations. I also want to highlight that what you're going to see now is a very condensed version of reflective supervision. This is not what it would look like typically, because I'm going to ask a lot of reflective questions, which is probably not realistic in the supervision sessions that you have. Maybe yours would look like throwing one or two of these out, but I just want to show you in a condensed version for the demonstration so you can see it in a variety of ways. All right. So Rochelle, what I find to be helpful now to try and forget that we have an audience is if you can pin my video. And so if you don't know how to do that, there's 3 bars on the top. If you click and you hover over your video, there's a blue box that has 3 bars and it can pin video. So I'm going to pin your video, and if you can pin my video, that might be helpful. Do you have that? Okay, so you can see only me now, right? Uh-oh.
No.
No, that's okay if it doesn't work. But if it does, it might be helpful to help pretend the audience isn't there. So again, I think if you click on those 3 bars over on your video, and you click on that and then you go down, there's a option called pin video.
I did.
Yes. Okay. Can you pin my video?
I think that's what I was doing. Yeah, it says pin, remove pin.
Yes, and then pin me. So you pin my video.
Okay. So pin.
It's okay if you can't do it. We can just keep on going too.
Okay. It says pin video. It says pins, but I'm just not seeing you by yourself. But that's okay. I'm comfortable. They're not there. What audience?
What audience? Exactly.
What audience?
Okay, great. Okay, so before we get started, Rochelle, just a couple of reminders. We're going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll let you know when we're getting near the end. I know. It won't feel like a lot. But again, if I ask you any questions that you don't want to go to, just let me know and I'll move on. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, okay, so I'm just going to take a deep breath to get present and to get focused for this conversation. So I just want to start. If you could think for a second, if you were to run into somebody who doesn't know you too much and only had a minute to sum up the essence of your job and your role, how would you describe what you do for someone who doesn't necessarily know your world?
I would say that I'm an administrator for a foster family agency, and we take in displaced children that has been removed from their home due to physical, emotional, well, not emotional, physical or sexual abuse in a nutshell. Just you said it in a minute. So yeah.
That was perfect. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. So what I heard you say is that you're an administrator and you take in foster youth who have been, who experience maltreatment, including physical abuse and other types of abuse. Is that correct?
Yes.
I feel like, did I miss any part of that?
Did I say foster family agency?
Thank you, foster family agency. Thank you for correcting that. I really want to make sure I understood you. Okay, perfect. And can you tell me a little bit more about what you do in your role?
Well, I oversee the organization. I ensure that policy, protocol, and procedures, standards from the state of California, from our accreditation program, COA, are met within the organization. I supervise 5 social workers, including a supervising social worker, and I have 4 support staff that I supervise. I also recruit resource parents. I do training for resource parents. I do orientations for resource parents, the potential perspectives of resource parents, and I have to visit the homes to make sure that they are in compliance on a quarterly basis. I do annual reviews with the resource parents to ensure that what they said they were going to do last year, that they're going to make sure that they do this year. So a lot of overseeing and a lot of supervision and just making sure that the organization is running up to speed. I also work with licensing. If there's an open investigation, if they open up an investigation, I'm the one that sign the documents once it's open, and of course once it closes. I work with 3 counties: Riverside County, San Bernardino County, Orange County. I also do placements within the organization. And like I said, just overall maintaining the agency and making sure that we are following the procedures of the organization in state and COA standards.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like you wear so many different hats. And I could tell you took a deep breath at the beginning before you got even into that spiel. So, am I correct to say that there's a lot on your plate?
Yes.
Yeah. It sounds like, from what I'm hearing you say, is that you interact with parents, staff, you supervise, you train. There's just a lot of different, and there's a lot of overseeing that happens. So there's a lot of engagement with a lot of different types of folks and a lot of different types of areas that you do.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose that profession? I'm guessing there's lots of things you could have done, but tell me a little bit about why you chose this.
Well, first of all, I'm a native from St. Louis, Missouri, and I moved to southern sunny California in March of 2007. And, back then I'm old school. So when you was looking for a job, it came in the newspaper as an ad. So I got the newspaper, and this facility was hiring for a social worker. So I applied. Now I lived in Moreno Valley. My office is located in Palm Desert. So I applied, and I met with the CEO, Sandra Austin, and we hit it off like instantly. And I said, well, can I call you boss? So she said yes. And I came on as a social worker. And I was a social worker from 2007. I was promoted to a supervisor in 2009, just to kind of handle a few social workers, because we had a pretty big organization, lots of kids then and social workers. So I was just kind of in training. And then in 2010, I finally took the plunge to become the full-time supervisor. And then I was promoted to the administrator in 2015. I came to this job because, for one, I just moved to California and I needed work. And my degree is in sociology and criminal justice. So I was like, how's this going to work? But I did do socials. We called it in St. Louis social service work. So I have been working with clients and getting jobs and, for other people and servicing them. So I figured, maybe I could use my skills and abilities to apply for this job. I didn't know because I've never been a social worker before. So I thought it would be something that was rewarding and I can help. And it turns out to be that it was. Like, I love my clients. I love the parents. I will take my kids from here to Blythe with no problem in my little Toyota Corolla. I put like lots of miles on them. My parents could depend on me. So to be able to help and to serve was the reason to come into the organization. So that's the reason that I'm here, and I'm still doing that, but it just in another capacity. To lead the team into service, good customer service with our parents and our staff. So that's why I'm here.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I can see you light up when you're talking about the service for your clients and even the relationships with your colleagues, with your boss. And so that really comes through. And I can tell that this is a job that you find a lot of
joy.
Reward in.
Yes.
Joy in. Thank you. Thank you for using those words. Yeah.
Yeah.
Joyful. Thank you. So with all that, it's definitely a noble calling, and there's a lot of joy there. And I'm excited to ask a little bit more about that joy in a second, because I really do want to learn more about that. I imagine, on the other hand, there's also a bit of stress and pressure. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
It escalates. It's one day and then some, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you mind briefly just sharing a little bit about what that stress is like?
Ooh. I had a situation, I can even say, because I try not to take on stress, because I believe I have the faith of God, and God leads and guides my day. The Holy Spirit gives me wisdom on what direction I take. But sometimes when I don't get in the presence, I can find myself being stressed about, for instance, we just completed a audit with Riverside County DPSS. And the stress level was so high for me because, one, it let me know that I needed to buckle down on my team, procuring documents that should have been in the files, calling the resource parents. Where is this format? Where is that format? Telling the staff, we need to have these forms. Why were they not in place where they were? So just being stressed about the process of being audited, it's a big undertaking. And it took us several years. We started this process in 2018, and I'm not kidding you. 2018, we started the audit process, and we just completed tomorrow is our exit interview. And so we get to find out where we need work at, because I know it's some things that we're going to have to tighten down, but just that whole process of not being able to go to my child's file and be able to pull out exactly what the county needed. That was very stressful, because for one, our resource parents have been trained, our social workers have been trained, and I have seasoned social workers, not someone just like, oh, we're new, we don't know, but the team knows what paperwork should be in process. And when that was not there, and then I'm having to call, because I want to do the best that I can. I want to show our agency we can shine, because we know how to follow policy. So that was very stressful. So now, guess what? Got to create another policy to ensure this is happening and that is happening when it's already written out. So getting my team to continue to follow the policies and the protocol and the procedures of the organization was very stressful. And then I was leaving last night, and I said, well, let me look at my computer. So when I looked at the computer, guess what? I got the findings back from the audit, because tomorrow's the exit. So they gave us, an agenda of what's going on. I didn't even open it.
Right.
Because I didn't want to take that home with me. Because I know we did good, because I was communicating with the auditor back and forth and some of the things. But when I see it now, even though we put it in place, it should have already been done. So I haven't even opened up the report even as of today, because I knew I was going to come to this wonderful training, and I did not want my mind to be so focused on what's wrong and what I have to fix. It may not be as bad as I think it is, because she did ensure me, well, you did this, she was walking me kind of through, but of course that final report is the report. So I'm not stressed about it yet, and I'm probably not going to get stressed, because I've done everything that I could possibly do, except for progressive discipline.
Got it. So Rochelle, I appreciate you sharing again all that with me. And it sounds like when you think and reflect back on the stress that you're having right now in the organization, and I just want to make sure I heard this correctly. It sounds like there's a bit of a weight on you to make sure that your organization shines, and that you hold that. And that's really important to you. And secondly, I heard that not only making sure all the procedure and the policies and the forms are there so that your organization can shine, and so that you can be the best that your organization can be, but also you can serve the clients and the best way that your organization can. Is that correct?
Yes, that is totally correct.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I wonder, is there anyone you can talk to at work about the stress of what's going on? Is that something that you could talk about at work or not really?
I mean, we mention it around here like, oh, wow, but to sit down and have the conversation. No, I take it home and I just pray. I pray and I do. I talk to my God, and
Mm,
he makes me well in it. All is
mm,
well. Don't worry about it, because he calms me down. Because having a conversation, I think, with other people about it, they're not going to be able to relate. I have friends that are in other industries. They stress, but when we talk, we don't talk about stress. We try to relieve our stress by having good conversations. So when I leave here, I really don't like to get on the phone and talk to people about my job,
mm,
because I left that already at the office. So
mm,
I no, I just pray, and like I said, I just talk to God about it. Like, oh
mm,
Lord. So before I open up this report, when I'm done with this, I'm gonna go outside and take a walk and do a good prayer, so
mm,
that I don't look at that report and go, have my
mm,
level rise. So tomorrow, when we do the exit interview and we talk about the corrective action plan that we're going to have to put in place, which me and my CEO have kind of like talked about. Okay, if this is happening, we're going to write this. So we kind of talked about the solution already without even knowing what the problem is, because it could be all green. I don't know, but
right.
I know some areas we lacked in, and it was kind of, to me, embarrassing. Like,
Got
come on,
it.
we should have this stuff. How are we serving? Like you said, go back to the service part. How are we service our kids without a
Mhm.
medical exam?
Right.
Where is the medication prescription? What if
Yeah. So
someone
Rochelle, I'm
comes
just
in
going to pause you for a quick second because I love your answer, but I just know we're running out of time and I want to be mindful to make sure
here?
I ask all the questions, but I do want to make sure I heard you because I think that point you were just making was so important. So it sounds like there might not be people directly in your organization that you talk to about that kind of stress. It sounds like that's not something that your organization does. But yet you found strategies that you use that are helpful in order to deal with the stress. One main one being praying in your faith that you really rely on. And that's really helpful for you. And then I also heard spending time and talking with your friends just about other things and connecting in that way and trying to create that kind of work life kind of balance for yourself in that way. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Was there I'm so sorry to cut you off. Was there anything else you wanted to share? I just want to make sure I heard that whole thing correctly.
No, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. We've got about 1 minute left
Okay.
before we close up. I just want to ask, you've talked a little bit about some of the stressors, a little bit about your role. You mentioned at the beginning that you use the word joy. So I'd just love to hear from you. What gives you meaning and purpose in this work, and what gives you that sense of joy?
The sense of knowing that I have helped
Mhm.
someone make it through their day.
Mhm.
I got a phone call yesterday from one of my resource parents, and before we could start off, she said, you know what? I just want to tell you that I appreciate you. No, Rochelle, I really do appreciate you. I'm like, oh, I appreciate you. She said, no, I really appreciate you because you are there for me. So when I get those type of calls from either my team or my parent, that is joyful. Just really walking in the door, knowing that I'm going to help somebody today, that's the joy that it brings me. And I've been with this organization for so long that my team is joy. When we walk in here, I have a happy team. We're happy. Good morning. We eat together. It's just joyful. We have good relationships. We work well together. So to be able to walk into an environment that's full of peace and joy, and then I add to the joy because I'm the little sunshine of the office. So yeah, that's what it is, and just being able to serve our kids and be there for the families, and even though there's a supervisor, there's a social worker, but when they call me, I'm happy on the phone. How can I help you? What's going on? And they love that. So that brings me joy to be able to serve. And when your CEO tells you you're doing a good job, that's even more joyful. So yes.
I love that. I love that so much. I love your answer. I love how much you own your joy. And I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I think I've heard throughout our conversation today, when you talk about serving the kids and families that you work for, that you kind of light up, and that brings brings out the joy. So I wasn't surprised by that answer, but I really appreciate you sharing that with me.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Great. So we are gonna probably pause there with our conversation. I just thank you so much. It's really brave of you to be willing to have this conversation in front of, I don't know how many people, but an audience that we don't know, especially seeing them in the background. So just thank you so much. Before we turn it back and I unpin my video, I just want to ask you what it was like to kind of have this conversation with me.
You know what? It was relieving.
Hmm.
A bit of relief, a sigh, like, whew, like, wow. And knowing that other people, you know, are on the line listening. And I know they probably deal with the same thing. I don't know how many foster family agencies are on the line, administrators, supervisors, leaders, counselors, therapists, you know, just to be able to share. So that's, you know, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to unpin your video now. And then if folks on the call can maybe do a little, just let's give Rochelle a bit of a round of applause, whether that's an emoji, whether that's a little thank you. If you guys can come and share your videos, if you feel so confident, I'd love to see your faces. And I'm going to ask you for some of your observations. So thank you so much for sharing. So now what I'd like us to do, either in the chat, which I'll try and keep an eye out for, but I'd also love to hear your voices. And so we don't speak over each other, if you can write your name in the chat and I'll call on you. Just some quick observations. What did you notice? Again, kind of focusing on me and the way I interacted with Rochelle, or the types of questions I asked, or how I framed them. And I could share a little bit about my thinking, but I'd love to just hear from you guys a little bit about just what were some of your observations. Again, you can chat, you can write them in the chat, or you can put your name in and then I'll call on you and you can share and we can unmic. We're getting some thank yous. I don't think this is a shy group. So thanks, Paula, for writing in the chat. So you listened and remembered well, so that your reflections were specific enough to let her know you were really listening. I really, really appreciate that. I'll comment on that one for a second. That really listening is really hard. That is a true skill that we have to practice because we don't do it often. Typically when we're talking with somebody, first of all, I had to take that breath to be present, just to reorient myself because I was in teaching mode before, but really listening and trying to hear, not thinking about, okay, what am I going to ask her next? Right? Because we do that all the time. Okay. Oh, I heard that. What am I going to ask her? Or not trying to even problem solve. I was just trying to hear what she had to say. And then I asked her every time, I just want to make sure I heard you right. Did I get that correct? Is that what you're saying? Right? So that we're really communicating authentically. So I really appreciate that point. Okay. So yeah, I noticed you took a deep breath and you grounded yourself before starting. So I'll share a little bit about that one too. So I think that being present for this type of conversation is very important, especially, you know, if we're walking down the hallway and, you know, I ask Rochelle, hey, how you doing? I know that was a hard case, or how'd that, you know, that audit's coming around, how's that going? And we're just in the middle of the, you know, cubicles. That's probably not the right time to bring up the emotional impact of her work, right? So I want to make sure I'm present for myself. I'm emotionally present, but I also want to make sure that we're in the right space in order to have this conversation as well. So I appreciate that comment. Okay. Affirmative body language, reflecting back what you heard and asking for clarity when needed. Absolutely. Those were some skills I was actively trying to use there. Body language is so important. And I noticed that when I stop trying to think about what I'm going to say next, my body language does relax a bit. And I really appreciate that comment because it's hard on Zoom. Like, we're on Zoom, there's people watching. So body language is a challenging one, but I think something we want to continue to keep in mind. Great. So I felt you started on a positive note and ended on a positive note. Absolutely. So for this particular instance, I wanted to honor Rochelle's bravery of participating in an activity like this. And so I did want to be positive in that. But I will say too that was genuine. My feelings for her and her presenting and her sharing and her joy, all of that was authentic. And when we're talking about reflective supervision and reflective practice, it has to be genuine. Your staff, your supervisees, they'll feel if you're inauthentic, if you're being inauthentic, right? We can sniff that out as people. And so I don't want to, say my admiration if I'm not truly feeling it. And so really being authentic in that is really important. So I love that someone mentioned that piece. So you gave her time to share not only what she does that benefits her agency, but who she is that benefits her agency. Absolutely. So how often do we get to ask our staff these kinds of questions, right? It's a lot. There will be time for asking procedure, yes, no questions. There's going to be time for that. But we also want to just take a little bit of time to ask those questions to get to know our staff, get to know her, get to know what her purpose is and her meaning is, right? Because over time, if we're in an agency that's, crisis driven or chaotic, like a lot of us are, that can get lost sometimes. Okay, so we also hear that you learn more from listening than from talking. That is 100% true. We really, really do. There's this study that I love. For those who know, they were with forensic medical interviewers. So these are folks that interview children to get information about the trauma they experienced. So they're trained listeners, right? And they did a study with these folks that they asked them to pause for 3 seconds after they asked a question, and they noticed that they got much more information from those kiddos, right? And so even just pausing after you're talking and giving some space for that person to answer, you're going to learn a lot more, right? Even after you ask a question and they answer, even being silent, you'll get more of an answer back. So again, not an easy skill. It sounds like it's intuitive, but it's something that really does take a little bit of practicing. Great. Yeah, so we focus too much on interjecting our own opinions instead of listening and caring genuinely. Absolutely. Definitely. I'm just going to scroll back up to see if there's any more comments that I missed. So Alex said, I noticed a lot of open-ended questions and it felt guided without being in like an interrogation. And that's a very astute observation. I really appreciate that. And that is really crucial to reflective supervision. This is not an interrogation, right? This isn't about procedure. Did you do X, Y, and Z, right? This is about a different kind of question to hopefully pull back and to think more expansively, to think a bit emotionally, right? So by its very nature, those types of questions have to be open-ended. Great. Excellent. Thank you so much for your participation in this part. One more thing I'll share that I was mindful of was I wanted to keep it broad. There were moments where Rochelle was talking about the stress and not being able to talk to others in her organization about the stress. And I was like, ooh, do I go there? I want to go there. Let's talk about that. Let's problem solve that. Let's figure out how she can do that. But again, it takes a lot of pullback on our part to say, I'm just listening. My role right here is to listen. I want to try and get the bigger picture, that gestalt, right? Without needing to always get those details. So I can really try and get the feelings and how that might impact her work. Now, if this was a longer time and Rochelle and I had longer together, I think that could be a place that we go as a supervisor. Okay, so you're not feeling like there's support or a place for that to talk about that in the organization. Let's talk about that. I want to welcome that in our supervision, etc. But in that moment, I just wanted to keep it to that bigger picture. Okay. Any other questions, any thoughts, any reflections about that process? We'll dig into a little bit more about what those skills were, but I just want to give folks a chance to either unmute themselves if they feel so brave and share, or if there's anything else they'd like to share in the chat. Okay. All right, well then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen back. We're all safe now. There's no more asking anyone to unmute. We're just listening now. Everyone can kind of relax a bit. So what we are going to do, though, we've been talking for about an hour and 15 minutes straight, so I'd like to take maybe a 5-minute break. When we come back, what we're going to do is dive into those skills a little bit more specifically, and then talk about some other organizational strategies we can use to address secondary trauma. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that reflective listening, using emotion-focused questions, how we model as supervisors, how to do this, and then a little bit about that compassion, satisfaction, that joy we get from our work. So why don't we take a 5-minute break? So it's 11:17. Let's just come back at like 11:21, and we'll start up again then. So feel free to just take a stretch break. I'm going to pause my video, mute myself, and we'll come back then.
So, see, unmuted. Now they can hear you. Click.
Okay, so
I'll give everyone a second to settle back in. All right. We're going to go ahead and pick back up. So, Jess, did you want to offer?
I do. Thank you all so much for coming on back from our stretch break. I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much, Rochelle, for sharing and for participating in this demonstration. As a token of our thankfulness to you and for sharing with us today, we want to offer you a trauma stewardship book. It's by Laura Van Dernoot-Lipsky. And you might have heard about this book before in previous webinars that were hosted by Dr. Melissa Bernstein. This book is intended to help caregivers keep themselves emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, physically healthy in the face of the sometimes overwhelming traumas that they confront every day. And so that will be on its way to you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, CalTrin.
Thank you, CalTrin.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to start to get into a little bit more of reflective supervision and the skills that we've kind of pulled out that are, we believe are the kind of those core components. Again, I want to stress that this is something that many of you, some of you might already be doing, and we're putting some like language to that, and that's great. For others, this might be a newer skill. As we move forward, I've got a bunch of resources to provide around this skill that we found helpful when we do this kind of training with folks around reflective supervision. So we're going to spend some time now digging deeper and going into each of these different skills. So I won't spend too much time here. I think we saw it in action. It's much better to see it in action, I think, than to read it on a screen. But we've talked about this reflective listening piece, and you guys in your comments were very astute about that piece. So really taking that time to truly listen, it really helps that individual, whether it's your supervisee or a colleague, to feel understood on that deeper level. Reflective listening can also help clarify aspects of the work for them and increase that communication to improve the quality of their work. So there's a lot of benefits here. Slowing down and mindfully listening before jumping in with a response, like we talked about before, can actually elicit more information from staff. So I've got here some examples of how we use reflective listening. So it's really just listening, summarizing, clarifying what you heard. So what I heard you say is that correct? Sounds like, is that about right? Can you help me understand? On the one hand, this, on the other hand, this. So that can be really helpful. Sometimes when folks are in a crisis mode or something's really pulling on them emotionally from work, maybe there's a critical incident, a child death, or just a challenging case, there can be different ways that folks respond. Just like for child trauma, there's a variety of ways kids can respond, right? There's always going to be a unique response here. And so sometimes we'll have staff that will be so overwhelmed and everything will want to come out. And this can be a really good tool to help pause and kind of ground that person. You're saying a lot of great stuff here. I'm just going to pause you. I want to make sure I'm hearing you right. And that can really help be as a tool, as a regulating tool for that individual. Others might kind of shut down and not want to share. And what I want to highlight here is we never want to force somebody to share the emotional aspects of their work if that's not where they want to go with you. For some staff, for some supervisees, it might come really natural. That might be nice. For others, it's not going to be, something that they kind of dive into. But what we want to do as supervisors, as managers, as leaders, is use these tools, or at least open the space up for this to happen. They don't have to join us, but we do want to open that space. And we want to open up that space regularly. So just a quick hey, that was a difficult case. Just want to check in. How are you doing with that? What feelings did that bring up for you, right? The problem is if we don't do that regularly, even if they're not engaging, then we end up doing it only when something really difficult happens, and that can kind of feel kind of punitive. So the more regularly we can use these skills, the kind of more natural it will feel in our interactions for our supervisors, for our supervisees, and make it feel safe. Okay. So the next skill you might have saw and that we're talking about is using emotion-focused questions. So how do we invite these emotions into the work, right? And again, when we're talking about the emotions, it's how they relate to the job, right? So always I'm thinking, even if they're bringing up personal issues or things at home or things that I don't feel in my role, maybe as not their therapist, that I want to go there. I always try and bring it back to myself. And what is that like for you in the role that you're doing? How does that affect your job? How can I support you in your role at work with the emotions you're dealing with, right? Again, that's what differentiates reflective supervision from that therapy component. So we don't want to force, again, or pressure anyone into sharing. We just want to open that space up. We're asking these feeling questions. Wow, what was that like for you? And just listening to that answer. Again, here we're not trying to fix, which is really hard, especially if they're bringing up those emotions. I'm definitely I'm guilty of that, of wanting to jump in and just kind of fix the problem. But again, we're just kind of listening and having them feel heard. So I want to share some examples with you. This is a handout that you guys will get. It's a handout we put together for supervisors, kind of like a desk cheat sheet, if you will, when you're engaging in reflective supervision or when you're just engaging in reflective practice. Again, it doesn't have to be within supervision, of asking these emotion-focused questions. So when that happened, how did you feel? What did that feel like for you? You seem very energized when you describe that family. What happened? What was energizing about that? Is it sometimes a strain to find compassion for this family? How does this case press any buttons for you, right? Again, here we are. This is reflective supervision. We're pulling for the emotional impact of the work without judgment, without trying to fix it, just listening to it. So hopefully this handout can be helpful. When I started doing this a couple of years ago, I would have kind of Post-its on my notes with some of the questions that I was going to ask, make it a goal for myself. Okay, in the supervision session, I'm going to ask a couple of these reflective questions and see how it goes. For those of you that are well practiced in this can just be a review to continue to keep asking these types of questions. For folks that are newer at this skill, hopefully this handout could serve as a bit of a guide. Okay. I do want to note, and I've been saying that this is not therapy, that there are boundaries in our role, right? And we need to determine what's relevant to the nature of the work versus what's outside our scope and what's outside our role. So if the difficulties that your staff are sharing that seem to be outside of the work context, then there might be a chance to maybe refer to EAP or to have a conversation about what other supports they can have. So it sounds like there's a lot going on today, both at work and outside of work. I'm happy to support you in the areas that overlap with your work, but let's think about other resources that can support you outside of work. Maybe a support a friend, maybe a referral to EAP. Let's see what we can come up with. So I just want to keep in mind that we do have those boundaries in our roles. Okay. So just going to pause here, a little reflection for you guys, if you can answer in the chat. How do you think using reflective skills within your organization will impact communication? Whether if you don't do that, think about maybe how they might. And if you already are in an organization that uses a reflective practice, that uses these reflective skills, I'm interested to hear about how that impacts the communication within your organization. So feel free to add that in the chat. Do we think they'll make any difference at all if we use some of these? Is it typically the way you talk within your organization or to your supervision? Thank you, Michael. Helps with clarifying, helps with clarity of expectations. Absolutely. I really appreciate that, especially when we're thinking about, a lot of miscommunication comes from having expectations that aren't aligning. So I think this can be a really good opportunity to clarify those expectations. I appreciate that. I think these skills can help people feel like they matter and also clarify there it is again, those expectations. I love that. It helps to create a common understanding that our well-being is important. Absolutely. It would help frontline employees feel heard under current stressful conditions. Absolutely. Ensuring that the information shared in communication is clear and heard. Great. Creates a safety to discuss the real emotions versus hide them. And I appreciate that, Rochelle. This does take a bit of bravery. If it's something that we don't do, it takes a bit of bravery on our part to open up the conversation. And if that's not something that we've typically done, to welcome the emotions in and to use those skills as being reflective. And it takes a bit of bravery and risk on the staff member's part to open up and share. So there is a safety that's needed there. Improving engagement and connection absolutely moves the conversation beyond problem solving. And I love that point. With most of this, when our staff or when we're sharing with each other, oftentimes, one, we just want to be heard. Two, when someone says, okay, let me help problem solve, that person's like, no, I got it. I know what to do with this. It feels really good to share. It feels really good to be heard. So oftentimes we know what to do as adults with some coping skills, right? But just that act of sharing and feeling heard can really be what that person needs. It encourages opening and understanding and empathy and growth and togetherness. Some good stuff. Thank you, guys. Okay. So let's move on to supervisor modeling. And what do we mean by this? So providing examples of our own personal experience related to the work can really help provide staff that safe place that we've been talking about to help feel understood, normal, and validated. So that safety that you guys mentioned is an important piece of this. It's an important piece of reflective supervision being successful. One way that we can help increase that safety is by modeling a little bit from ourselves. So sharing our own emotions. I heard one person say that they give name to the feeling if that staff member hasn't named that feeling. So it sounds to me like you're feeling confused. I just want to make sure I get that right. Is that correct? It helps normalize the situation and it reduces that shame or guilt about the emotions of the work, right? So here are some examples. When I was going through a similar case, I felt really nervous for those home visits. I'm wondering if that's a similar or different feeling that you were feeling, right? So we're modeling. I'm going to share a little bit about myself. I've got feelings too. Wondering if that's something for you. When I have those types of cases, I know I feel really frustrated. I'm curious to see how you're feeling about that case, right? One thing I will note with this skill is we do want to warn against sharing too much of ourselves and our own experiences, right? We don't want to get into this one-upping with more stories situation. Let me tell you how bad it was for me. But rather it's an opening, again, if talking about the emotional aspects of the work isn't something that you've done with that staff member or in that supervision or with that colleague. Modeling can really provide that sense of safety that I'm opening up this conversation and I feel safe engaging in it as well. Great. Okay. So this is the last skill that I wanted to talk about, and it's something that I made an effort to address too in the demonstration with Rochelle, which is compassion satisfaction. And this is discussing the positive outcomes that were derived from our work, right? So we typically focus on the struggles or the difficult parts. If I ask you what are the parts of your work that are stressful, boom, 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 we can list them off. But if I'm asking you what are the parts of your work that bring you joy, that purpose and meaning, oftentimes you have to pause for a second and think about that, because we're not really asked that question often in our organizations. Yet it can be so, so helpful at times to focus on the positive and the joys of the work that we do, especially the difficult work that we do. It helps staff to feel supported. It helps us to feel supported. It boosts confidence, right? So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So you're also going to get a handout with these prompts because I find them quite helpful. So again, in a supervision session, these can be used in other interactions within your organization. But just asking our staff, asking your colleagues, where do you find joy in your work? What were you proud of about that case? I often try and use this one when I did supervision in a supervision session where that staff member just felt they did everything wrong. They're like, this went terribly. And maybe a lot did go terribly, but there's always one thing that we can be proud of, that we can feel good about, even if it's really small. What did you feel successful about today, or even this month? In unit meetings, we can use this, right? Not just in supervision. Let's go around and share one thing that we feel proud of. And so this is really important when we're talking about reflective practice, to bring in that. We want to bring the emotional impact of the work in. That's what reflective practice is. But not just the difficult feelings, but also the positive feelings, and open up a space for that. Okay. I think this is my last question to you guys. So I know I've been asking a lot of you and a lot of your engagement. But I wonder for you, could compassion satisfaction questions, do you think this is easy to build in? Is it a strategy that you could incorporate into supervision, incorporate into your organizations? If it's something you already do, I'd love to hear about that as well. So just pause here and we can chat a little bit about compassion satisfaction. And if you feel so brave, you can always put your name in the chat too, and I can call on you to hear your voice. I'll put my therapist hat on and be very good with silence. Okay, so thanks, Mary. So building a peer group for supervisors to practice reflective supervision among one another. I love that. So we've done that with several organizations that we've partnered with. We've done a training like this on reflective supervision, and then the supervisors set up their own group to talk about how it's going. So, wow, I did that. That was really bombed. Or I've tried to incorporate these questions. It really seems to be working. So I think that's such an awesome suggestion. I really love that. And I think it also gives support to supervisors, right? Oftentimes we stop getting that supervision. So I love that idea. In our meetings, maybe start with a check-in. I think that is like such a great, powerful, easy to do solution, right? Just the way we start our meetings, starting off with a positive tone, even if there's a lot of difficulty going on. So I really appreciate that. Sharing this info, sharing the handouts with the rest of your supervisory team. I really hope you do that. That would be wonderful. That's a great example. Great. So Laura's example is that she supervises social work interns and asks that they share the best part of their week and why, and the most challenging and uncomfortable part of their week and why. And I love that so much. There's a term I stole from Brian Miller, who is an expert in compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, and he calls it grace and goosebumps. So everyone go around the room and say something that gives you grace, and then something that gave you goosebumps. So I love that idea. These are such great suggestions. Our team meetings can get really negative. Meetings can get really negative. And so spending talking about the things that make people feel proud can really help refocus the energy of the room. Thank you so much, Melissa. It really does. It really shifts that energy when we start that way. When we can also not only point out things in ourselves that we're proud of, or point out some things in our team members that we're proud of. That's one activity that I know our organization does, is we've got these little silly trophies that we use that are quite fun, and we give them out at our monthly meeting. Say, I noticed that Jess did a really great job, setting up this training, and it was just so wonderful. Here's this little trophy, and we pass it around each month. So I think that's a great suggestion. Okay. Yeah, so having a kind of a supervisor group, that can be hard. I know our time is so limited, and finding those times to set up yet another kind of meeting is so challenging, but I do think there's so much benefit in those. I love those ideas. What's worked well? Thorns and roses. Oh, I love that one. Susan, I'm going to steal that. And I really love this last point Mary made, that most of the staff that choose this work are coming from a place of compassion. So this should be easy to accomplish when supervisors model and make a space or specific time to share. I think there's so much in that statement. There's so much truth to that. We all do enter this field from a place of compassion and a desire to help, and caring, right? Why we're talking about this and we're talking about compassion fatigue is that over time, unfortunately, without things that we're mindful of doing ourselves and without organizational support, that compassion, that initial compassion, we can get separated from that a little bit. And so I love the emphasis here in your comment on the organization, on the supervisors, to create that space to model that for staff and to have time set aside to address the compassion and to bring that back into the forefront. Again, all of this is pretty intuitive, but I do think it requires a bit of structure for organizations to keep this in our minds, in our forefront, as we're always being pulled in so many different directions. So I love that. Okay. So I will share with you all, this is another handout. There's lots of handouts in this. This is another handout that my team actually created, which is a reflective supervision quick guide. So all of the skills that we just went over, reflective listening, emotional focused questions, supervisor modeling, and compassion satisfaction, it's just like a desk guide to kind of trigger you into what we learned about today. So in this guide, it will be the skill, the definition of what that skill is, the purpose of why we're doing that skill, a little bit of the language you can use to practice, and then some things to avoid. So hopefully that will be helpful for folks as well. Okay, so in the 15 minutes we have left, we're just going to shift into one other strategy we can use in organizations. So one is attending to critical incidents. I wanted to share a tool that we created with an organization that we partnered with, that they were really looking for a tool that supervisors could use to support staff in responding to critical incidents. And what I mean by that is things like when there's news that a child has passed, when it's a really high profile case or a significant, child maltreatment has occurred, or even within the organization, maybe an employee passed away, right? So I'm just going to share a tool. It's yet another handout you'll get, but I just wanted to share this with you all and kind of go over it together. So it's a manager wellness check. Again, there's lots of times, especially during a crisis, that we can forget that self-care piece, that self-reflection piece, that reflective listening piece, because things are moving so quickly. And it might not be in the immediate present that you'll be able to use this. It might have to be later on, but this is just a helpful tool to remember the emotional component of these crisis-driven moments. So in this resource, it's just a 2-pager. It introduces the resource, right? It's to assist supervisors and managers in supporting staff after a critical incident occurs. It's not a script, but we do have examples of what you could say. So how to introduce a call, how to provide grounding, how to provide some positive praise. We go into how to provide that emotional check-in, how are you holding up? There's a lot going on today. How are you doing? Let's take a moment to check in about your feelings. Encouraging agency support, right? I'm here to support you, so feel free to reach out if you need anything else. Using that reflective listening and encouraging that compassion satisfaction. Thank you for your dedication to these agencies and these families. The work you do is so greatly appreciated. Lastly, encouraging that self-care. So what are 2 things you can do for yourself today to take care of your needs? Or who can you contact? Who's a supportive person that you can contact to check in? Oftentimes, there are 2 kind of main reactions that we see after a critical incident can occur. So things like shutting down. So it sounds like you're ready for this day to be over. Would it be okay if I check in with you a little bit later? So kind of respecting that, where that staff member might be at, but letting them know that you'll be there for them at a time that's better for them. Also, sometimes we see some dysregulation. Sounds like today was especially difficult. Who can you contact right now to provide support for when you get home? So I went through that really quick. You'll be getting that handout hopefully can be helpful in addition to maybe some of the policies and procedures that you already have in your organization for when critical incidents occur, or just again as a helpful reminder for how to incorporate some of these reflective practice components during moments of crisis. Okay, I think we hit on most of these because you guys are amazing, but let's just make sure we've hit on these. These are some day-to-day trauma-informed practices, ways to use this reflective practice that we've been talking about. So I think you guys already mentioned how we open up a meeting, having that consistent, transparent communication, recognizing those goosebumps, using those individual recognitions, and reinforcing that well-being. So kudos, you guys did the slide before I got to it. I mentioned this book in the last webinar I did. I'm going to mention it again here. And I mentioned it in the organizational strategies part of this training because in the last organization I worked with, we used this book as a book club. So we each read a couple of chapters and then we got together and we discussed it. And it was kind of a game changer for us. This is a book about the impact, the emotional impact of this work and secondary trauma and how we can't deny that and how we learn to address it and how we learn to talk about it. So I highly recommend it, either to read personally for yourself or if it's a tool that you want to use with your organization. I find it to be quite powerful. Okay. So we're almost at the end here. We'll leave some about 10 minutes for questions. I just wanted to let you know the information that I've been sharing today, the resources, the content, it comes from my work at the ACTS project, the Advancing California's Trauma-Informed Systems Project. We're actually recruiting to partner and do this trauma-informed work with for counties across the state of California. So I just figured I would share my information here. You can go on our website for more information. There's also an email here on the slide if you'd like to get in touch to learn more. On our website too, there's more information around secondary trauma and resources around secondary traumatic stress. Okay, and with that, thank you guys so much. This has truly been a privilege and a pleasure to be able to engage with you all and talk with you all about this topic and connect. I really appreciate all of your engagement and your insight, and I feel like I learned from you just as much as hopefully you learned from me. So thank you guys so much. And I will pass it over to Jess.